Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. We go first to Peru, where protests have been raging ever since the arrest of ex-president Pedro Castillo. The new president, Dina Boluarte, has proposed early elections amid a state of emergency, and armed forces are due to take over key facilities in the country. Next up, the United States is hosting an Africa Leaders Summit in Washington after an 8-year gap, while imposing key sanctions on Zimbabweans. And finally, a group of physicists in the United States have announced a breakthrough in nuclear technology. We discuss these stories in detail on our show today. Peru's new president, Dina Boluarte, has hinted at early elections as protests rage in the country. People are out on the streets ever since former President Pedro Castillo was forced to exit office and detained. But the proposed early elections are still 2 years away, while Peruvian demonstrators seem impatient for change. They're calling for another general election. They want the Congress dissolved and a new constituent assembly. Let's go over to Zoe from People's Dispatch, who tracks the region. Zoe, great to have you back on the show. Zoe, important developments in Peru. Can you just bring us up to speed on what the latest is with the protests and what the government is saying?
Well, now it's been exactly a week since the legislative coup, which took Pedro Castillo out of office. And since then, he has been arrested, held in detention, and there's been massive protests on the street. This has been protests across the country, not only in the capital Lima, but in cities in the mountainous region, which was actually the base of support for Pedro Castillo. And in these mobilizations, they're calling for restitution of Pedro Castillo, which is a reversal of the coup. They're calling for him to be released immediately. Many are calling for the renunciation of Dina Boluarte, who was his vice president and who's now acting president. Many people say that this is she assumed president illegally. And since then, she's made an alliance with the right wing, so has completely turned her back on the people. In addition, they're calling for an end to the repression that they're facing. So far, 8 people have been killed during these protests. And finally, they're calling for a constituent assembly to be held. This was one of the major campaign promises of Pedro Castillo to rewrite the Peruvian constitution, which was enacted during the former dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori. Of course, it's important to point out that his daughter, Keiko Fujimori, was the front runner in the last elections when Pedro Castillo emerged victorious. So all of these demands really have to do with changing fundamentally the structure of Peruvian politics, how things are run, who has control, what rights are, what things are concerned as rights and what things are concerned as privileges. Peru is one of the most unequal societies in Latin America and the Caribbean, maybe on the world as well. And so these are kind of the fundamental demands that they have. And for many, the coup against Pedro Castillo really crystallizes this hatred of the oligarchy in Peru, the hatred of the ruling class that it has for the poor and oppressed in the country. There's been so many racist slogans and accusations made against Pedro Castillo because he's precisely a peasant, he's a rural teacher. And so it's really for many, it's a class war situation.
It's also fascinating that, what Pedro Castillo was trying to do and what he set out to achieve is exactly what people are out on the streets for now.
Yeah, precisely. As I said, the Constitution has been a major demand. This is something that we've seen across Latin America very often, because a lot of these constitutions were written during the period of military dictatorships. They were written by oppressive governments that wanted to take away rights from the people. And so that's why we see in the government of Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez took office, one of the first things he did was call for a constituent assembly, rewrite the constitution into something that actually creates an alternative state structure. In Ecuador also, we see the rewriting of the constitution. So I think it's so important to understand what this demand really means. It's not just about a abstract document. It's about creating a country, creating a state that works in the service of the people. And it's also important to point out that, of course, Pedro Castillo was elected in June 2021, and many of the campaign promises he did haven't been able to fulfill. But it's important to point out that this, as we've covered on this show and on People's Dispatch, is really due to this right-wing pressure that they never gave him an inch of breathing room. There had been investigations and accusations, impeachment hearings constantly since he took office. So a lot of people, a lot of right-wingers will say, well, he deserved to get impeached. He deserved to be taken out of office because he wasn't able to do anything. And it's exactly this that he wanted to change, that the people of Peru wanted to change, to take away the power from this very corrupt elite ruling class. And it's also important to point out that Pedro Castillo wanted to eliminate immunity for elected officials. So many members of Congress have active and open cases against them for corruption and other charges, but of course they're not able to be prosecuted because of this immunity. And interesting to point out that one of the first things that this right-wing Congress did after impeaching Pedro Castillo was to rule to remove his immunity. So now he can be charged with any charges they decide to file against him. And as Pedro Castillo himself has pointed out, the judiciary is controlled by the right wing. So they've already charged him with ludicrous things: usurpation of power, breaching of the Constitution. And he has been writing a bunch of letters from prison, delivering it to his lawyers and his allies, calling for his human rights to be respected, calling for the respect of the human rights of the Peruvian people, which, as I said, have been heavily repressed in these anti-coup protests. Already 8 protesters at least have been killed in the repression from police. So all of these things on the table right now, it's a very hot situation, and it's honestly changing every day.
And will the offer of bringing forward the elections by 2 years actually help change the situation?
I think it's a sign of weakness of Dina Boluarte, because she sees that the people are very angry, that the people are on the street. She wanted to concede one of their demands, which a lot of people are calling for fresh elections to be held. But others point out that this electoral system doesn't really work in favor of the people. And that if you keep the same constitution, if you keep the same political structure, not much is going to be able to change. We saw that Pedro Castillo was in office for 16 months and he was really unable to do anything because the Congress is so controlled by the right wing. All of the electoral machinery in the country is so controlled by money and the oligarchy. So I think it is an important sign that the will of the people and the massive mobilizations that they've been organizing has effectively put pressure on the government. And she's trying to make a concession that she thinks will maybe calm people. But it's clear that the people actually want structural changes. They want a new constitution. They want a say in politics. And they want an end to this corrupt ruling elite that essentially crushes all of their aspirations and is now putting their candidate, their president, in prison.
Right, Zoe. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Today's nuclear plants split open atoms that releases energy which gets harnessed as electricity and other applications. Now scientists in the United States say they tried the opposite, bringing atoms together or fusing them, and it worked. Fusion produces more energy than fission, but mashing atoms together also uses much more energy. The United States scientists say they have produced more energy than they used, and that's their breakthrough. Why have physicists from the world over been experimenting with fusion for decades? For example, at the 35-nation International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor in France. What are the possible applications of the success in the United States? Prabir Purkasa is here with us with details. Prabir, can you talk about the experiment which the United States has said has succeeded? What was it all about?
What you're calling about is the fusion reaction, in which they seem to have got more energy than they have put into the fusion reaction. So yes, it's an important technical breakthrough. It's the first time out of fusion we've got more output than what we have put in. So really the fusion energy generated is more than what the actual energy put in for the specific process at the end of this whole technological experiment. That's that last step. We produce more energy than we actually gave it. But if you take the whole process, then of course it's not true, because the lasers themselves needed much more energy. This process was really firing 192 laser beams at a small capsule, a golden capsule, if you will, within which there was two isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. And so this whole lasers which are synchronized, fired at these atoms, lead to their collapse, and therefore it creates fusion by which they convert into, say, I think in this case, helium, by which the difference between the hydrogen atoms coming together and forming the helium is released as energy. And this whole process, the last step, where the lasers are fired, the laser energy and the output from the fusion, the output from the fusion was a net gain. That's why this is being called the net gain experiment, which has succeeded. But at the same time, as I said, the lasers themselves, when they are fired, they also have an energy conversion. If we take that into account, then of course there is no net gain in the process. In fact, lasers take about 100 times more energy than we've got out of it. So I'm not going to get into that. It's a technological breakthrough, not in terms of a realistic timeline within which we can get fusion energy, but at least a breakthrough in terms of, yes, this is possible. Can it be scaled up? Will this particular technology succeed in being scaled up? Is an open question. And you must also realize that the other projects which are there in fusion do not follow this path. They use what is called magnetic confinement, inertial confinement. These are what are called tokamaks, the rings, in which you magnetically compress the hydrogen isotopes, and that leads to fusion. Again, the same principle. They're coming together, collapsing and releasing more energy than what we've given to it. They have not shown net gain as yet, but there is a Chinese project, there is a combined European project, which I think is located in England, and there is, of course, the ITER project, which is located in France, in which India is also a participant. There are, I think, 32 countries participating in the ITER project. It's an international effort. So yes, in terms of research, a breakthrough. In terms of feasible fusion energy, far into the future, based on what we have seen till now. But yes, when, shall we say, the first aircraft that flew, Wright brothers, we didn't know that we are going to get this aircraft industry 100 years later. So all of this is to be considered a step forward, but making viable nuclear fusion energy, we are far away. We are really far away off.
Prabin, the application part aside, there are claims that this is a green fuel, that it does not create radioactive waste. Is all of that going to be true at some point in the future?
Good question. Yes, it is green energy, provided we make it successful, in the sense that it is not going to release carbon emissions. True. In order to make such facilities, of course, there will be carbon emissions. That means we need always sunk carbon to create even this fusion or fission energy possibilities, both of which do not release carbon emissions. So infrastructure, to build infrastructure, yes. Carbon emissions for continuous basis, no. So that is one part of it. Can it be provide us with a green future? Well, we still have to see successful fusion energy, and it has to be commercially successful. So it's not just that we can get more energy than you put in, but what is the cost of that energy, given the capital cost involved? How long does it last? All those questions are very much, at the moment, I'll only speculate. And it is true for science and technology. All of these are steps, big step forward, but at the same time, to talk about its economic implications, very difficult. In fact, the Chinese and the ITER project both seem to have reached a level where probably the commercialization will take place before this one really reaches a commercial stage. And let's not forget, the National Liverpool Laboratory is this particular facility, what's called the National Ignition Facility, if I'm not mistaken. These are essentially for checking that the atomic bombs were in good order. So you take a little part of it, fire it to the lasers and say, yeah, it's okay. It really works. Everything is fine. But its purpose was not fusion research. It's because the facility is there, it's been used for fusion research and successfully used. And that's as of now, it's a byproduct of the National Ignition Facility. We have to see which direction, how much investment, how it goes. and how it can be scaled up. But let's be realistic. Not in my lifetime for sure. In your lifetime, fingers crossed, because that's about 20 to 30 years away. That's a realistic call would be not before next 20 to 30 years. And in technology predictions, 20 to 30 years is saying we really don't know whether it can be done or not, but not right now. That's really the issue. And it's not as a technological issue as much as an economic issue. Of course, we can get from fusion nuclear energy. That's not an issue. The question is, can we give it to the grid? Can you give it at a cost by which we don't, we spend much more than what we get out of it? These are the questions we need to solve. So that's really a far way off. But yes, we still need to welcome it as something which is like the Chinese tokamak experiment, like what was done in England by the European group, and of course the ITER, which probably will see the light of the day, become functional, probably in the mid-30s. So that's still quite a long way off.
Right, Prabir, and thanks a lot for joining us. On December 13, a 3-day summit of African leaders began in Washington. The summit is being seen as an effort by the United States to counter Russia and China's growing outreach on the continent. African countries see it as a chance to insist on engaging as equals with the world. One backdrop to the summit, attended by 50 leaders from Africa, is ironically of the United States sanctioning the son of Zimbabwe's president. No stranger to economic barriers erected by the United States, United Kingdom and European Union, Zimbabwe's foreign minister is attending the summit. Sanctions against the southern African country invite strong reactions from African nations. Abdul from People's Dispatch joins us with more details. Abdul, thanks for joining us. So, Abdul, Zimbabwe not a stranger to sanctions by the US. What explains this current round of sanctions?
I think this is again the same US policy of uninvited interventions in the domestic affairs of a particular country. And Zimbabwe is not new to that. It has been facing the US sanctions since 2000 at least in various forms. So this sanction in particular basically is targeted to a particular individual, but this is very obvious that this is an attempt to intimidate the Zimbabwean government to basically pursue the policies which favors US, because though the common Zimbabweans are not very happy with the government, there are protests going on for almost 2 years against the government's economic policies, which has created a lot of hardships for the common people there. The left in particular has raised different kinds of movements demanding a kind of reorientation of the policies towards the people and end of corruption and other things. These are the issues. There is no doubt about it. But the US intervening in this affair is primarily with the policy, with the thinking that the government in Zimbabwe basically should adopt a kind of policies which favors US interventions in the region. So that is one primary explanation behind this particular decision at this moment. But at the same time, the timing of the sanctions also raises some kind of questions about the overall thinking of the US policymakers at this moment, because they are, as you rightly pointed out, there is an African summit going on, and at this moment, these sanctions can create other diplomatic problems.
Right, Abdul. So it's also like sort of ironical as well as interesting that the summit itself in the United States is being seen not for what it is itself, but for the effect it will have on, say, China and Russia, and so the targets are different. So can you talk a bit about that?
Exactly. See, US, when it comes to Africa, US has a very strong military presence on the continent, but in last few decades, at least in the last decade, the influence of China and other countries have increased many folds, primarily in the areas of economic development. When it comes to development initiatives, when it comes to economic investments in mining and other areas, when it comes to the trade relationship between the individual countries and China and US, China has gone much ahead of US, and this, of course, is never a welcome development for the US policymakers, given their larger orientation towards Africa, their attempts to basically have a presence there and to have a decisive say when it comes to the Africa's fate. So, given that context, US is looking forward to basically recreate the possibilities of American reestablishment of American and its allies' economic hegemony on the continent. So African Summit is a step towards it. We should also see it as a part of the recent US policies vis-a-vis China. In the global context, there are sanctions against Chinese. There is an increasing talk of a new Cold War which is happening, and US has basically identified China as its quote-unquote primary enemy. So in that context, the summit, African Summit, is primarily an attempt to win over more and more African countries and win over Africa to snatch it from the so-called Chinese hegemonic presence on the continent. So in that context, this is happening. We don't know which way, what will be the outcome of it, but at least the US is trying to do it. But as I said before, trying to influence the African countries to move them away from China and to create a greater presence on the continent, at the same time continuing with the much hated, much criticized policies of sanctions, internal interventions in individual countries. Both of them cannot go hand in hand, and that is the basic contradiction behind at this moment.
Right, Abdul, thanks for that update. So, Abdul, just before we leave, what is the United States actually scouting for in Africa? And also, can you lay it out on a geopolitical map for us? Africa, China, one thing, but what about the rest of the world?
Well, given the fact that Africa, though, is one continent, there are the countries, more than 50 of them, are quite diverse in many areas. So it is difficult for the US what it is looking for. Of course, the primary objective of the US is to kind of regain the economic advantages it had before the Chinese took over. So that is one primary objective, but also it's an attempt to kind of what US says to basically isolate Russia and China. Russia has a very strong presence in Africa in terms of economic and other relationships with the individual African countries. South Africa, for example, is a part of BRICS, which is made by Russia and China together. So US is trying to create a presence there in that term. As I said before, Africa is quite a diverse continent. There is North Africa, then there is a Southern Africa, and all the rest of the countries have their own different strategic interests. So it will be difficult for the US to kind of manage all of it, particularly given the fact that it is still looking negatively towards the continent as an attempt to isolate Russia and China, not to kind of create policies which will basically create a democratic environment, international politics, where individual members of China, of Africa, African continent are given their due status in the global politics. That is not what US orientation has been so far, and the case of Zimbabwe proves it again, that US wants to quote-unquote develop friendly relationship with the African continent, but at the same time it wants to kind of threaten them with different kinds of punitive measures like sanctions and so on and so forth. So this duality may not, will make it difficult, particularly at a time when the African countries have got an option in the global politics, unlike in the past.
Right, Abdul. Thanks a lot for joining us with that update. And that's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. We always look forward to seeing you Monday to Saturday. You can find our stories on peoplesdispatch.org and you can find our updates on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.